So we are going to do counseling survivors of abuse. This is session 4. We're going to look at chapter 2 of Mending the Soul Workbook, part 2. And this is calling things what they are. All right. So we talked last time about how important it is to start, if you're doing a small group, or if you're doing one-on-one counseling, either one, is to do, the greeting and prayer, welcome everybody, or welcome the counselee. And if you're doing the small group, to review again the guidelines for a safe group that are on page 26 of the workbook. Now, remember we said that the natural pause point on this was going to be, there's a shift here. It starts at page 60, where we start giving the names to the 6 major forms of abuse. And the goal was to try to get up through page 64, where the wheel of abuse was. The second half of this chapter, you can take 1 to 3 weeks or longer, depending on the size of your group and how extensive the abuse histories are of the people that you're working with. I've even had one-on-one counseling where this chapter has taken 4 weeks to get through this one chapter. Now, there's a few approaches that you can take that are going to require some prayerful discernment on your part in order to figure out which one's best for that particular small group. So one approach is to allow each person to summarize their experience with this half of the chapter, the whole thing. Just kind of walk us through what your experience was like with this whole chapter. Budget the time. So we're going to give each person 12 to 15 minutes to just kind of do that. So you define in advance how much time each person has available, right? Or you can take each category of abuse and provide opportunity for each person to share their results from the exercises under each one. Or as each category of abuse is reached, allow for a conversational approach to the material. Now, it might be too early to do that for this particular group, but this is the approach that we eventually want to develop as we progress through the material. You want them to be kind of automatically conversational about it. So in determining which of these approaches is best to take, you need to be sensitive to the dynamics of the group, the personalities involved, the amount of brokenness in the group. If there are strong personalities who tend to dominate conversation, select a more conservative and manageable approach. And if you have group members who have a tendency to be reluctant to share, having a more conversational approach may work best. So there's 3 passages of scripture that we look at as kind of anchor verses or passages for the week. First is Psalm 16:8. I have set the Lord continually before me. Because he is at my right hand, I will not be shaken. Matthew 5:4. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Because we're speaking the truth, and we're going to be mourning the evil that's been perpetrated and the loss that goes with that. And then Psalm 91, of course. All 16 verses can be read throughout the week. Important keys to this chapter. It's important at this stage of the healing journey to understand how significant it is to be as clear as we can about what has taken place. Now, when the process is painful and shameful, our tendency is to withdraw and avoid. This is the opposite of what we need to do. Remember, we want to continue to encourage them to be brave, to pray for courage, and to lean in and press in and speak the truth about this, even though it feels horrible, because it's only happening to their emotions, to their feelings, if you will. They're not really being damaged. They're not really being wounded. They're actually squeezing the guck out of the wound, if you will. So it's important to encourage them to acknowledge the reality that what happened happened. It's important that we don't minimize and don't deny, and that we don't call it by the wrong name. Also need to try to see how what was happening was perceived and understood by the version of you that you were at the time. Okay. Now, one of the things that we want to continue to reinforce is that, I kind of joke, it's against the rules for this version of you to look back at that version of you and judge that version of you for not knowing what you didn't know, for not knowing what this version of you knows. It's against the rules to do that. This version of you does not get to judge that and that version of you. Doesn't get to shame, should, condemn. Okay. We're not doing that. That version of you didn't know better. This version of you does. So we're not going to fall into that trap. Okay, we're actually going to say that version of me got deeply wounded by this and had no way to avoid it or didn't know what to do with it. So the wounding that version of me experienced makes perfect sense. Also need to recognize where you are now, or from where you are now, the limitations that you had at the time, and acknowledge that the person who offended against you was at fault. You were not. It is not my fault, was not my fault. Because remember, the person who's victimized is never to blame. It's not their fault. They're not responsible for being victimized. Okay. And another key point of this is to saturate your mind with God's promise that he was fully aware and will demand an accounting one day. So God is not going to let this go unaddressed. And in his perfect timing and in his perfect way, his justice is going to be exacted for this. It will happen. That's how God is. Okay. Now, knowing what you do now, accept that the person or person who offended you did so based on their own history of abuse and brokenness. And understanding leads to healing. And of course, this doesn't mean that their woundedness makes what they did excusable or any less heinous than it was. What it does help us do is surrender thoughts that we did something to cause them to oppress or abuse us, and the toxic shame that results from that. So no more I could, should have done, said, been something different to prevent or stop what was done to me. We're not doing that anymore. This is fully on them. It comes from their own brokenness. We didn't cause it. We didn't create it. And then by being clear, bringing things into the light and calling things what they are, we gain understanding not only what happened, but of the effects it has had. Okay. Someone doing this and harming a person in this way, the most normal effect of that is going to be the effect that it had on me. Because part of what we're doing here is we're going to be in agreement with God with speaking his truth about these things. Give them the right name, put them in the proper category. And, excuse me, if I were to see this happen to somebody else, I would expect it to impact them in this way. So it does make perfect sense that it impacted me in this way. And then we want to make sure we tie in the reading from the Green Book, the exercises in the workbook, and the Wheel of Abuse all together, continuing to help them build this inventory of language to be able to speak accurately about these things. Okay, so several points to stress, and we visit these every session. Number one, what was done to me was not my fault. Number two, it is never okay with God for one person to misuse or abuse another. God is my healing Redeemer. And we are not reliving the past. We're simply examining it to understand how we got to where we are. Remember, we're not reliving the past. what's interesting about that is we're not even digging up the past. We're turning around and facing the part of our past that seems to be haunting us and breathing heavily over our shoulder, right? Hindsight is always deceptive because it is always easier to see the past with greater clarity than we had at the time. So what that means is our tendency is to use our current understanding and perceptions to judge the earlier version of ourselves or our circumstances. Okay, so we can look back and say, man, yeah, that was horrible, that was evil or whatever. Weren't even able to use that language or even dared to use that language or think that way at the time. Okay. 6 is gaining perspective is an important part of successful healing work. The exercise we're going through help us gain the perspective that we need. Okay. So then we want to start getting into the workbook. And one of the things you can do is just do a check-in. Say, okay, what was the most significant thing that you experienced as you went through the chapter, or this part of the chapter this week? Okay. And just let them talk. You don't need to respond. You don't need to delve in and counsel. Give them an opportunity to share. And if you're doing it in a small group, let them share, let them respond to each other. And you're going to have to, sometime early on, you're going to have to leave some pretty good sized gaps of silence. Remember, silence is not your enemy. You guys remember me saying that? This is going to be one of those times when you really need to remember silence is not your enemy. And by being silent, you're just leaving it open to whoever wants to respond to respond. And there's an unspoken expectation that somebody's going to speak into that. You can say, how many of you discovered things going through this portion of the chapter that were a surprise to you? Okay. Let's talk about that a little bit. What was that like? You know, what surprised you? How did that feel? Why do you think it surprised you? Or why do you think we don't identify as abuse some of the things that we experienced when they actually actually were? Okay. And some of the answers you're hoping to hear are some abuse behaviors are minimized societally and within our family culture or church culture. We've had desensitization to holiness in our culture. So this stuff, yeah, well, it just kind of goes on. So we just don't think a big deal about it, even though God has some very strong things to say about this stuff. We learn in our abusive situations to separate ourselves from the situation or blame ourselves for it. And protecting ourselves by denying that abuse was present. And we have to be careful not to swing too far the other way, where nothing was abusive, now everything is. Right. One of the things hopefully you all got the email that had all the sample forms, including the one about learning to tell your story, preparing to tell your story. Right? And it's important to help people go from reporting to sharing. Okay, so what do you think the one ingredient is that has to be added to our words in order to take it from reporting to sharing? You're muted.
A pronoun, putting ourselves in the story, so we're not.
You can use I all the time and still be just reporting.
I don't know what one word it would be. I was just thinking there needs to be some emotion involved of some kind. Emotion attached to it that's not just anger.
But I said, what is the ingredient, not the one word?
Oh, ingredient. Oh, then I guess I was thinking emotion.
Yeah, emotion. You've got, yeah. Are you really connected to the legitimate emotion of the experience? That's when you're sharing. Not just describing it. Oh, it really made me mad. Or really, really upset me, really broke my heart. I was sobbing and crying, and it sounds like you're describing what you had for dinner at Wendy's. You know, there's just no connection, no personal connection to it. and here's a question. How much of an emotional connection to your story as a child can you find? Now, we're not going to revisit that child. We're not going to try to become that child, because that isn't real in our present lives. Rather, you might think about that earlier picture of yourself as a child. And you remember that exercise on page 49. Say, think about that earlier picture of yourself as a child and ask yourself, what impact did those events have on that child's life? Understanding that that's an earlier and younger version of you. Now, it's really important at this point for you to be on the alert for someone saying, I didn't realize that I'm in an abusive relationship right now until I went through the wheel of abuse. So say, let them talk about that a little bit, and then ask them, are you making any plans to do something with that, right? And see if you'd like to talk about it after group or something, we can do that. And get them connected to somebody that can help them with that. If you're in a counseling relationship, you're probably going to have to hit the pause button and address that some. Again, so the way we're dealing with this is, or talking about dealing with this is either as in the small group environment or in the one-on-one counseling environment. We also want to review the healing model on page 141 of the Green Book. Okay. Step 1 is safety. So no healing can begin without first feeling safe, right? So if they're currently in an abuse situation, they're not really going to be able to do the healing work until they are safe and feel safe. So they may need to start focusing on that, and being in the group and doing this work may not be time for them for that right now. Okay. And then you kind of look at the other steps to healing as a review. Now, the version of steps to healing that we use in our ministry is more complete than the one you find in Mending the Soul, because it goes one step further to be comforted and be a comforter. And you can find that in Appendix B in Behind the Veil, page 253. All right. So I want to talk a little bit about, we talked about how we've got the 6 categories of abuse, the 6 main categories of abuse that we pick up on. Well, we kind of summarize in pages 60 through 63. We've got the wheel of abuse on 64. We talked about that on page 64. I want to revisit the wheel of abuse on 64. They'll talk, they're going to be surprised by things. They say, well, I never considered that as abuse. I can see the way it's laid out here, that how that could be considered abuse. What's interesting is they may be currently in a relationship where some of this stuff is going on, and the last thing that the person they're in that relationship with would ever be open to receiving is the diagnosis or the assessment that their treatment of the person qualifies as abuse. Okay, so it doesn't matter. We have to really prayerfully say, Lord, what do I do with this? Okay, I've got this humiliation thing going on. Okay, there's a belittling, it's a demeaning, there's a berating, there's this making me feel less than. That's humiliation. It's one aspect of abuse. It's one aspect of relational oppression. It's never okay with God for one person to demean, degrade, humiliate another person. God humbles us, but he doesn't humiliate us. There's a big difference between those two. So I'm going to kind of open this up a little bit as we go through this. So when we start on page 66 and we start talking about these, I want to ask you, as you looked at the workbook, page 66 and 67, that deals with verbal and emotional abuse. What were your thoughts about this when you looked at those exercises and you looked at what's the information that's laid out? What thoughts did you have? What kind of things did you say? What did you think about the exercises? What strengths or weaknesses, or what surprised you, or what confused you? What was your interaction? What was your assessment of this material on these 2 pages?
For me, it reminded me of when I was still in grade school. The abusers were actually bullies, same age bullies. Mm-hmm. So, because I grew up, well, I went to school in a very exclusive school, so a lot of spoiled rich kids. I was the only poor kid probably there, but so they would belittle me, and they would belittle other people. You know, the top dog would always have his goons behind him, and they would bully everybody else. So that was a big change for me, coming from a very protective home. Because we were six kids in the family, or 7 kids actually, and we would live in this compound, and we would play with each other, when we were kids. And then we would have to go to school where we're unprotected, and that was a big contrast. I didn't have friends growing up in grade school. Maybe it was only in the last year, because again, we weren't rich. We didn't have connections like the others did, Mm-hmm. So it reminded me of,
So you're describing your own experience with verbal emotional abuse. Did you see it that way?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And then what also I just realized was even the teachers themselves, they were also bullies. There was one, I wasn't very good at math, and there was one teacher who would fund people who couldn't, keep up with the classes.
Okay. So when you look at the material as an assessment, so you get your group or your counselor saying, I experienced verbal abuse when so-and-so said such and such. So what do you think about that as an exercise for someone?
Opening a can of worms.
Which is the point of this.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you think the result of that is going to be?
Well, a relabeling of experiences, perhaps, if things were not categorized that way before.
Okay, but what's the result going to be then?
Forgiving ourselves for not.
That's on the far end of things. But on the front end, what's that going to be about? What's going to happen?
Realize that we were bullied, or we were abused.
Again, we need to use bullying. Bullying is verbal emotional abuse and often physical abuse because there's a physical intimidation that goes with it. Okay? Think of it. We're a lot more comfortable using the term bullying than we are saying verbal, emotional, and physical abuse.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Calling it bullying is almost soft selling it. So what do you think is going to happen to the person emotionally?
He'll feel shame,
Okay.
sadness, loss, maybe some confusion. How come I didn't know this before? Maybe helplessness because there's nothing you can do about it now.
What about on the positive side? What might they think and feel?
Validation, because there's probably some sense that something wasn't okay.
And that it was okay for them to be bothered by it?
Yeah.
It's okay for them to hate it and be hurt by it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
To connect, an ability to start connecting with their own experiences.
Right. Because remember, it says, how did writing the sentence make you feel? Include both positive and negative feelings. That's what we're looking for.
Mm-hmm.
We're helping them speak the truth about these things, but then connect with the legitimate emotional content of the experience or experiences and speaking the truth about it. That's what our hope is in this. That's what we're looking for, or looking to provide. Okay, so take a look at the three-part exercise in 67. What do you see there as far as having somebody in one-on-one counseling or your small group go through this? It says reflect on ways you've experienced verbal abuse. Reflect on ways you responded to verbal abuse. How have these messages shaped your behavior? Because don't forget, what we're looking at is this person did this, God calls it this, it had this effect on me, this is what I did with that, this is the impact it's still having today. All of that helping us move toward this is what God's remedy for that is and what God wants me to do with it now. Okay. So we have to remember, so one of the things say, so as you look at verbal abuse in your childhood, let's say, what were some of your responses to what you were hearing from those who ought to have been nurturing you with their words? And as you look back on it, do you see it any differently as an adult? And it's important to help them understand that verbal emotional abuse is oppression at its core, denying and belying the imago Dei, the image of God, in the person being abused this way. And help them understand that demeaning, degrading, and humiliating nicknames are all forms of verbal emotional abuse. And you can't separate the two, okay? You can't have you don't have verbal abuse without emotional abuse. Okay? Because verbal abuse, the point of verbal abuse is to tear down the person, to tear them down. But our words are supposed to build up, aren't they? Isn't that what God says?
The leveling comes into play.
You broke up. What was that?
This is where leveling comes into play too. You know, because I was mentioning this to somebody, and we were saying, you know, if the wife was really verbally abusing the husband, but then she said, you know, well, the husband is doing the same thing too. So here we are, you know, where both of them are at fault, yes, but isn't there like a degree where one is actually doing more than to the others? How do you
Maybe, but the bottom line is we're not using one person's sinful behavior as a measure of whether the other person's behavior is sinful and heinous and condemned by God or not. And that's what leveling does. Leveling is not using the cross of Christ.
standard?
Right. It's not using the life and cross of Christ as a standard and as what will balance the accounts, using somebody else's sin to balance the accounts. The cross is the only thing that can do that. Maybe they both have something to repent of, but so one person is predominantly being verbally and emotionally abusive. If the other person reacts to that and say, well, they do it too, okay, like I said, I slammed your finger in the door, right? But you're breaking my fingers and my toes. So they're not the same. And you're using the wrong standard of measure. Okay. Well, you're bad too. Okay. So one person's verbally tormenting another child. One child's verbally tormenting another child. But this person over here is a serial killer. Well, you're both doing evil, so it's the same. It's the same. It is not. Stop doing that. It is not okay. Knock it off. Leveling is absolutely not okay. It is a manipulation tactic to get off the hook for your own sin, or to let somebody else off the hook for their sin. The only getting off the hook for sin is confession and repentance before God. Right? Okay. So let's move into 68 and 69. First thing I want to ask you is, when you look at the sketch on page 69, what's your response to that?
The log in your eye.
What?
Log.
I don't understand.
He's pointing. So whenever somebody points at you, three fingers pointing back at him. That
Okay.
thing.
Okay, I get. Oh, I did. Okay, I didn't understand what you meant. Well, look at the facial expression. What does this picture communicate to you? What kind of an emotional response do you have to this picture? What kind of emotional response do you think the people in your group or your counselee are going to have to this? I know people that have been triggered and gotten angry at this picture. This didn't used to be in any of the older versions of the workbook. But it was so triggering because it captures so well what a lot of them experienced, that I've actually had people say that this sketch itself being in here is abusive.
Can you show me a picture of the what you're looking at? Because I think I have the older copy. Oh, okay, yeah. Mine looks like this.
So you don't have the second edition? No. See, that's the first edition.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
That's why we specify the second edition. So take a look at the picture. Hannah, what do you think?
Yeah, it's pretty uncomfortable.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, some say, well, it just shows how much you need the healing. Maybe, but wouldn't that be called secondary trauma? Re-traumatizing somebody to prove a point?
Hmm.
This is one of the reasons why I can't get the older version anymore. I can't get the version that you have. I wish I could. But I've had a lot of people, especially domestic abuse survivors, really triggered by that picture. So what I try to do before we get there is give them a warning. If you've had somebody screaming in your face, there's a sketch on page 69 that captures that look. So be ready for that. Okay. So make a note when you get ready to start this chapter that you give people a forewarning about that. So let's talk now about the exercises here. Okay. So take a look at what's described in the paragraph. And you take a look at the inventory exercise on page 68. What do you think would be a good approach to that exercise?
I'm not sure I understand the question. What do you mean? How do we present it to them?
Yeah, as you're going through and reviewing it, how would you approach it?
Maybe start off as a third person, so it's not too personal.
Like what?
Do you know anybody who experienced threats?
But that's not, but see, that's not what this exercise is about. This is about them identifying their own.
Okay. Well, no, you were setting an approach. For some people were very,
No, but what I'm saying is they've already done this homework away from the group, or they've done it between counseling sessions, and you're going back and reviewing the work that they've done.
Okay.
So with that in mind, what do you think would be a good way to approach this in the group setting? When you've got an exercise like this, one of the easiest questions to ask without I don't know, without it being a leading question is, so what did you do with the exercise in the gray box on page 68? You see how that's open-ended? And then let them share. You know, it says identify which types of physical abuse you've experienced or are experiencing. What did you do with this exercise there? And then let them share. And what's interesting is sometimes people will not mark things that you know from their story that they've shared already that they ought to have marked, but they haven't properly identified it and put it in that category. So be alert to that, pay attention to that. Okay. I've had people say, I marked every single box, or I marked all but 2 or 3 boxes, or I marked these 6. You have other people say, why do they have emotional abuse as physical abuse or domestic violence? Say, well, why do you think they would do that? What makes you, what would go through their mind that they would put emotional abuse? especially if you look at stalking, intimidation, and then emotional abuse. The stalking and intimidation maybe stalking, does that feel right? Well, that's a threat of. We have to understand there's a threat of violence is the same as the violence being done. A lot of times people have a hard time bridging that gap. But like we visited a couple weeks ago, in the criminal codes of a lot of states, it uses that kind of language. Threat of violence is considered physical abuse. It's actually considered assault in some jurisdictions. So even though they didn't lay hands on anybody, they basically made them fearful that it was going to happen, and that's considered the same thing. It's actually a pretty biblical idea, don't you think? If you ogle a woman with intent of lusting after her, you've the same as committed adultery. It's about intent, right? So I experienced physical abuse when so-and-so did what? All of the above. All of these things, except for this. Or they may lock on to two things in particular, because maybe several of these things happen often, and some of these things only happen occasionally or once. Okay. And this is why we pay attention to that and say, okay, so you were stomped on a couple of times, right? But you got choked 30 or 40 times. Okay, so being choked 30, 40 times, you felt like you were going to die, and that was terrifying, right? Being stepped on, being stomped on a few times, didn't feel anywhere as threatening. So it doesn't feel like it's as big a deal. But again, we got to keep coming back to what God says about it. So while you may not have felt as if you were in as much danger in one case as you felt in the other, you have to remember, what does God say about this? And God says this is physical abuse as well. Okay. Sure, we want to talk about the effect that's had and the ongoing effects, but we need to make sure we're talking about it and we're in agreement with God on it. Okay. So, like Steve says in the Green Book on page 29, he says, physical abuse, domestic violence, is a perversion of God's assignment to us to care for and nurture creation and the family members he's given it to us to care for. All right? So what about page 69, the exercise there? How did you feel when writing about physical abuse? And what fears do you have as you put your abuse into words? Were there any positive feelings? You're not looking for anything specific. You're looking for them to share whatever their thoughts and feelings are on this. And you want to affirm and validate those things. Okay? Even if, say, well, I didn't really feel much of anything because it was so much a part of my life, I kind of got used to it. Okay. And that makes sense. We can get kind of inured to the emotional impact of some of this stuff over time. So let me ask you, if you saw this happening to one of your children, or you saw this happening to a next door neighbor, what would you feel about that? Oh, there's all kinds of emotional content now. Remember, part of what we're trying to help them do is connect to the legitimate emotional content of their own life so they can actually heal the damage that's been done. Because it's there. And they've stifled it, they've tamped it down, they've denied it, but it's still there. All right, so let's move on into pages 70 71. Talk about neglect. And remember that this is a perversion of God's assignment to parents or caregivers to provide for a child, or spouse to provide for another spouse, to tenderly care for his creation. Now, this is overtly the opposite of physical abuse, but it produces the same results. A lack of trust and a sense of shame. So when you take a look at the first and the third paragraph that talk about it, and then you have the second and fourth paragraphs on 70, which are vignettes, okay, or discussions from Ziegler, right? When you take a look at neglect, you take a look at, as you were going through it yourself, did you underline or mark anything in the text on that page? Anybody?
Maybe for me it would be the lack of emotional support.
Okay, I'm not talking about the gray box. I'm talking about the left-hand column, the 4 paragraphs. Did you mark anything there? Anything stand out in the text of the page? Because this is a question you're also going to want to ask your small group or the person or the individual that you're working with. You really want to help them learn how to interact with the material well. No? Okay. So then in the gray box, identify the areas of neglect you've experienced. And then it says number 1 through 10, 1 being the least severe and 10 being the most severe. Now, I'm not crazy about that grading thing, but it is the way they have the exercise structured. And one of the reasons I'm not crazy about that grading is because a lot of people will feel very comfortable with minimizing what happened and lowball things that may have impacted them in an extremely powerful way. But lack of adequate clothing. Well, well, I'll put a 1. There were times when we, clothes were we didn't seem to have, what we needed, but not a lot. Well, so describe that to me. What does that mean? Well, we were, like a lot of families, a lot of hand-me-downs. Okay, so what kind of repair, what kind of condition were those clothes in? Right? Did anybody in your family have good clothing? Well, Mom always had. She always had the best looking clothing. Well, you see an imbalance in that, a gross imbalance in that. And it wasn't that they didn't have the money. It wasn't that they were just a poor family. It was that Mom was making sure her clothing, her appearance was pristine, and what was happening with the kids really didn't matter. So there can be some things going on in there that you need to talk a little bit more. Lack of physical touch. Okay. That really needs to be lack of appropriate physical touch, because some of these people have been touched physical abuse and sexual abuse. And so that one can be kind of a dissonant for them. Okay. So helping them recognize that. So that might be one of the things you want to give them a heads up on before they get to this exercise the week before. Hopefully you're making notes about this. Okay. Insufficient personal hygiene items. This will come up often when you have women who, when they reach puberty, mom didn't adequately prepare them for that, didn't provide them what they needed, those kinds of things. There's a severe amount of shame that goes with that for young women. Anyway, those are the kinds of things to be on the alert for. And then again on page 71, how did you feel when writing about neglect? And what fears do you have as you put your pain into words? Were there any positive feelings? One of the questions I'll ask is, were there any responses to the detailed description of neglect that you read on page 70? Okay, what was it a surprise that neglect is described as the most pervasive and persistent form of trauma, and that it affects every aspect of the developing neurological system in a child? Was that a surprise? See if they're understanding why neglect, again, it's abuse in the negative. It's in what didn't happen that was supposed to, and can actually be more prominent and have even darker consequences. Neglect is one of the key forms of abuse that underlie the lives of those who become sociopaths and narcissists. It's a big deal. What about the exercise 71 where it says, God, there's something I want to make right, and you talk about conviction? This is where they take a look at, you know what, I've done this. I've been neglectful. I've been verbally abusive. I've been whatever. So you give them the opportunity to deal with that guilty conscience. Make it right with God. So again, that's where they have it in this version of the workbook. So I'm going to pause the recording. We're going to take a break, come back in 10. Okay, we're going to push into 72, 73, and 74, which talk about spiritual and religious abuse. Okay, so this can get into pretty in depth and in detail. You've got the 4 components that they talk about: power posturing, performance preoccupation, unspoken rules, and lack of balance. So one of the things I try to do is give people kind of like summary statements for those 4. So power posturing is continual asserting one's authority over others. Performance preoccupation is external performance, not internal character. Unspoken rules is don't ever disagree with the pastor or whoever is the spiritual leader, or you are being disloyal and unspiritual. And then we have this lack of spiritual balance, which means spirituality is either exclusive to the pastor or truth belongs to everyone's interpretation as long as it comes from God's voice, who happens to be the pastor, right? Or it can be in a family as well. So we have to understand that leadership, biblical leadership, is always servant leadership. It's always for the good of those being led. It's not for the good of those leading. And the example, of course, we have is in John 13 with Jesus washing the disciples' feet. And he says, I've given you an example, now go and do likewise. So one of the things about the exercise here, these 4 columns, is people may need help sorting through the things they've experienced and putting them in the right place. They say, well, I wasn't really sure what to put down or where to put things down. So let's kind of talk about what those things were and help them sort through it and categorize it. And it's not so much the importance of categorizing them right, but helping them think about it well. Okay. That's what we're after, helping them put things in the right place. Okay. And then you've got page 74, you got the exercise, journal how spiritual abuse has affected you. One of the things that you look for, and hopefully by now you've been paying attention to whether people have become perfectionists, people pleasers, whether what's their view of God? Do they see God as demanding attachment? Do they feel like they have to really be on guard against getting it wrong? Of, well, you know, I really have to make sure that I'm not doing this and not doing that, or that, you know, I'm being good in this way or being right. So they become they're judging themselves. They're their own judge. They have their own standard of measure they're using for them to decide if they're measuring up to God's standard. Well, so what the thing that's defective about that is Jesus is the only one that can measure up to God's standard, and he's done that for us. So by having that critical spirit toward ourselves, that usually comes from some form of abuse. And you generally are going to have spiritual abuse as at least one component with other forms of abuse, especially verbal emotional abuse. A lot of manipulation, just emotional coercion. Okay. You've got this picture where, because of toxic shame, you've got this person, they feel that they're completely shameful. And everybody else is separate. You don't measure up. You are less than. Yeah. And this little vignette here, authority. I was afraid of it and resented it. Authority was intimidating and became my aim to get around it. Look, whenever you are asked by the pastor to do something in church, it is as though God himself was asking you to do it. The pastor's eyes told me he was serious. Okay. Or anytime the pastor accused you of something, he knew you did it whether you believed you did or not. I see that a lot. Well, that's not really what you feel. There's something else going on here. So idolatry is putting anyone or anything in place of God. And so, but this is a coerced idolatry. They didn't even know any better. But it's still a form of idolatry. And the thing that repenting of that brings is freedom from that. I don't have to do that anymore. I don't get to do that anymore. And I'm not condemned for it. But God is showing me he's the only one worthy of worship. His opinion is the one that matters. Reading your thoughts, this whole vignette on page 75. Again, it's a very long vignette. You ask people, what was your interaction like with this like? Okay. And have you recognized spiritual abuse from either your parents or church leaders? And what have you done or do you wish to do about that? Because sometimes they've never done anything else, right? All right, so then we get into kind of the biggest, darkest one of this, and that's the sexual abuse. We have to remember that God designed sex as the most powerful bonding activity in which we can be engaged in as human beings. Okay? And that's what from page 28 of Steve's book. Therefore, when we are sinned against sexually, when we're harmed because of sexual sin, or we ourselves sin, the damage goes beyond anything else we can do with our body. So what it does is it causes survivors to struggle to accept their own bodies and their own sexuality. So enjoyment of sex in the sanctity of marriage becomes difficult or impossible. Abusive sex equates to sex no longer gives life, it destroys life. Right? So the incongruity of physical pleasure and sexual abuse is one of the most disturbing factors that trouble many sexual abuse survivors. And it's talked about on page 79. There's a key point that has to be visited there. Physical pleasure is a biological reality. And it's something that's how God made our bodies to respond. It does not mean that the abuse didn't happen or that what happened does not qualify as abuse because their body experienced physical pleasure. We'll talk a little bit about that more in a minute. But as they're going through the exercise, 76, talking about sexual abuse, and then getting into the details. Sometimes it's very, very hard for people. But we take a look at acts of sexual abuse. Non-contact, sexual contact with digital or object. Digital means finger or toe or something like that. Oral and then penile penetration. These are, increasing severity of sexual abuse. And we talk about increasing severity. It's how much of an invasion is it? How much of God's design is violated in this? And we have to remember that one adult can sexually abuse another adult. This is not necessarily about an adult sexually abusing a child, or even an older child sexually abusing another child. This can happen between adults as well. One of the most common times or ways we see sexual abuse is when you have two sexual abuse survivors sexually abuse each other. They objectify each other and use each other sexually. You see that played out a lot in adolescent and teen years, and sometimes, and into college years sometimes. And it's one of the problems with this highly sexualized society that we live in. It basically encourages and promotes people mutually sexually abusing each other. So when you take a look at this material, understanding that for some people this has been a very difficult few pages to get through. So one of the things to do is say, okay, walk me through what stood out to you on page 76. Okay. Anything in the vignette at the bottom of the page that really struck a chord with you? See what kind of response you get. So as you go through these, the lists on 77, some of this may have been very triggering for you. When you look at this and understand that these things were things that were done to you if you experienced them. Okay, you didn't invite this, you didn't ask for this, you didn't deserve this. So how were you, or what were you able to do, or what were you unable to do with this exercise? Were you able to do it at all? Okay, let's talk about what the outcome of that is. Okay. Sometimes people will say, I experienced almost all of this. Okay. Was anybody surprised that sexual nickname and sexual conversations with a minor were considered sexual abuse? Because remember, sexualization of a child is sexual abuse. And a sexualized nickname, even conversations like a grown man with a teenage girl or younger girl even. Oh, you're a little hottie, aren't you? That kind of language is sexualization. And it's sexual abuse. It may not be chargeable, but it's still sexual abuse. It's introducing adult sexuality into a relationship where it absolutely does not belong. That's sexual abuse.
Would you say that those child contests is sexual abuse?
I think they are. They sexualize these little girls, and I mean, even some of the dancing that these little girls are doing, right, out of hip hop and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
It really upsets me when I see that. Really upsets me when I see that, because it's all sexualized. Let people talk through what they experienced as they went through this part of it. 78 can be very, very triggering, and it can be very freeing too, right? When you read through what grooming and sexual abuse look like. I've had people going through this. As I read through this, I suddenly, a relationship I was in when I was 13 with an adult, okay? Youth pastor, or neighbor, or coach, or somebody. I see some of it. I never saw it before. And I don't think anything. And they say, well, I don't think anything happened. And then all of a sudden there's a blank spot. They can't remember if anything happened or not. Others will say, yeah, I experienced some of this. I didn't experience all of it, but the first 4, yeah, I really, really experienced that. So maybe it didn't cross over into sexualizing the relationship, or maybe they didn't see it. But the grooming, and people want to say, well, what if it was just a kind older person showing an interest in a younger person? Maybe it was, but how much of this is there? And what did it feel like in your soul at the time? When you look at it now, do you feel a flush of shame? Because maybe intuitively there were things that you picked up on that you didn't have a name for, weren't able to articulate. We're not trying to make something out of nothing. We're trying to help them connect with what's really going on in them. So that, okay, so maybe this flush of embarrassment you feel is like you're saying, well, when I look at this, and I did have somebody in my life who was like that, are you feeling a flush of shame that, about maybe you didn't recognize that it was leading, building up toward sexual abuse? What's that feeling of shame about? Give them an opportunity to sort through it. Again, at 79, how could it be abuse if I experience pleasure? That's how God designed the bodies. One of the things that I've seen, especially with teenage girls who are cutters, the vast majority of them have been sexually molested, and their bodies responded. They're punishing their body for betraying them. Not always, but often. And the pain of all this doesn't make sense, but these cuts on my arm or my inside of my legs, that pain makes sense. There's a reason for it. Another thing we find with this is that sometimes they'll make themselves unattractive. They'll put on a bunch of weight. They'll stop taking care of their hygiene. And I'm going to be real blunt here. One of the things that I've often heard reported was, my uncle started touching me, and my body responded, and he reached down and touched me down there and said, "See, I know you want it because you're wet. That means you want it." And she said, "I was so confused that I didn't say no. I just let it happen." And the horrible shame that she feels as a result of that, right? And again, there's this ambivalence. It was an incredible first sexual stimulation and experience, and by God's design, that's pleasurable. But the moral cost of that is severe, and she hates and loathes herself because her body responded that way. But I've seen that happen, heard that happen with young men too, who had an older boy or man touch them and they responded. Okay, so they're taking on a sense of guilt and shame and responsibility for something they had no control over. So helping them walk through that is important. There's this healthy parental response if a child has been sexually abused. People read through that. Well, that's not what happened. We didn't get help, or they weren't sorry. They denied it. That's why we have exercise in 81. Did you disclose your abuse? Tell that story here. Okay, and then, how did your parent or caregiver respond? Now, I was over 40 years old before I ever disclosed sexual abuse that I experienced. And I shared that fact with my mother, and she said, there's no way that happened. That did not happen. And it was years before we ever talked again. The impact of being called a liar by somebody who is supposed to protect me, where they'd rather stick up for and defend the offender and that changed my relationship with my mother forever. Really hard, dark place for survivors to be. One of the examples I use about the brain and about the body is someone who hates being tickled is pinned down and mercilessly tickled over and over against their will. No matter how much they detested the ordeal, they would involuntarily laugh. It would be gross ignorance about the normal human reaction to tickling to presume that the uncontrollable laughter indicates that deep down she wanted it. Likewise, when one's body involuntarily sends pleasure signals to the brain in response to sexual molestation, it says nothing about one's morality or attitude toward the offense. And again, the information about grooming and sexual abuse on page 78 can often trigger very strong reactions from group members as vivid memories surface. So help them keep fresh the truth that those things are past and are no longer taking place. Accurate perspective, that was then, this is now, is vital. Okay. And then we have narcissistic families, the other kind of pain, page 82, 83. Now we're going to revisit this in chapter 4 in greater detail. But what's presented at this point, the information serves to help the counselee or the participants in the group understand where some of their poor relational patterns may have developed from. So when we go through this, when we take a look at the symptoms, if you will, the spectrum of manifestations or expressions of narcissistic family on page 82. Give the folks the opportunity to say, yeah, this sounds like my family, or yeah, this sounds like us, or no, I didn't see anything here like us. Okay. But then take a look at the descriptors, if you will, on page 83. This is where we help them recognize the tendrils in their life of what they've experienced, how they've been impacted by the selfishness of their family. Remember, narcissistic families and narcissistic family systems, it could be a business, it could be a church, something like that. The image of the family is more important than the individual members of the family. The needs of the individual family members are expendable for the sake of the image of the family.
Like the Godfather?
Sure, but think about it. Don't you dare embarrass me in front of the people at the church, right? You be careful how you behave. You could destroy my ministry. I hear that from pastors and from pastors' kids, right? But also families that aren't in a position of importance like that. I know one family where there was the belt hung on a hook on the inside of a hall closet, right? And these children were beaten mercilessly for all kinds of infractions. And if they were out in public somewhere, you know you're getting the belt when we get home. Absolutely terrifying. One of the daughters in this family that I counseled, as an adult, she said, I can't even tell you how many times I peed my pants, and got another beating for that. But when people from the church were coming over for dinner or any game night or something like that, that belt suddenly disappeared from the hook on the hall closet door. It was hidden away from sight, so nobody had any indication that was going on. So I said, does that tell you your parents knew it was wrong, that it wasn't okay? Well, they said people wouldn't understand. No, people wouldn't co-sign. People would understand, they wouldn't co-sign. So as they walk through the exercise on 83 and look at the descriptors there, say, yeah, these describe how I have been in situation. I feel easily defeated. I have this chronic need to please. You're taking a look at the effects, the residual effect of abuse, especially narcissistic abuse. Then 85, of course, when we come to the end of chapter 2, we've got a journaling page, my thoughts and feelings, and you give them an opportunity to share that, right? So, and we have to remember when we're doing that, what we're looking for is chronic or intense manifestations, not occasional things, right? And encouragement we take is in Matthew 5, verse 4 that we talked about earlier. Jesus came to comfort those who mourn. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. He is the one who came to bind up the brokenhearted and to set the captive free. While what we've been examining is true about our lives, these greater truths about Jesus and what he came for give us the hope and strength we need to journey into healing and wholeness. Right, so let's talk now about preparing your group for chapter 3. Chapter 2 helped us begin to identify the what of our stories. Chapter 3 moves us into looking at and identifying the who. This is what happened, and we touched on who did what. But now we're talking about profiles of abusers. So in the book, Dr. Tracy identifies some general characteristics that are common to abusers and describe different types of abusers. The workbook allows us to look at our abusers and begin to identify some of those characteristics in them, to be able to say, yeah, that really was them. That's how they acted. So we will finish chapter 3 by beginning to develop a more accurate profile of those who harmed us. Because it's important for us to understand that, because we have to figure out what we're going to do with that. Okay. And one of the things too is encourage people to look at Appendix 4, reading chapter 3. I think that's part of your reading assignment. Appendix 4 gives warning signs of potential abusers. So if you see these things, it doesn't mean that person is an abuser, but they're warning signs that this person potentially might be. And the more of those that are present, the more likely that is. So you look at Appendix 4 in the Green Book. It goes with this chapter. Right? So why is this important? It's often hard to make sense of our experiences, and it's part of stage 2 of healing, facing the truth and feeling. It's easy to believe that it was our fault because of blame shifting and the displaced shame that goes with that. Okay? It's helpful to understand some general characteristics of abusers to aid us in differentiating our responsibility from theirs. And it's also empowering to define and describe something and properly categorize it. The clearer understanding we have, the stronger and freer we are. Okay. So things to remember as you're working through chapter 3, and you can share this, you can read this to your group. You may experience some very unsettling, confusing, and fearful emotions as you begin to look more closely at your abuser or abusers. This is normal. Remember to pray and ask God for extra courage as you continue on this path and delve into this chapter. Now, we are not judging our abusers. We're simply speaking the truth about them and what was going on. Now, many are reluctant to speak the truth about who hurt them because they feel like it's being judgmental, or they may have been told it is not their role to judge. Again, we are not judging. We're leaving that up to God. What we are doing is looking at what happened to us, who did it, and identifying who should carry the responsibility and guilt for the sin. Okay, so we're facing the truth of what was done to us and by whom it was done. And remember this, facts don't judge. They're simply facts. And John 8:32 says, you will know the truth and the truth will make you free. So closing prayer as you get ready to go into chapter 2, pray for them for courage in the week ahead to honestly look at their abuse and their abusers. Thank God for the work he's done so far and has yet to do. And for each person to know and feel the comfort and counsel of the Holy Spirit this week as they go through and work on the exercises. So, general counselor to counselors and group leaders. Understand that chapter 2 can often be the most difficult chapter for some in your group to work through. So gentle patience without allowing overly detailed discussions is key. Help them find ways to give voice to their emotions as they speak the truth about what they experience. So sometimes you can say, if somebody else, if what you're describing happened to someone else, what do you think it would be reasonable for them to be experiencing emotionally? Because sometimes they just don't feel like it's okay for them to feel those things. Don't pressure anyone to recall what they cannot remember. The Holy Spirit will prompt them when and as he sees fit. The what is not as significant as the how to heal. So even though the details are vague or lacking, the impact and effects of abuse are evident. So we may not be able to tell exactly where this came from, but as you read through this, you say, oh, that does describe me. So that indicates that I experienced this form of abuse in some way that I'm not able to identify. So how do I heal of this? Because that really is the point. It's not as much the point of what happened and who did it, but now that I recognize what happened, that this happened, and this is the effect, how do I heal of that? Okay. So we're not digging up the past, right? We're not digging up the past. We're allowing the Holy Spirit to bring to the surface the things that need to be addressed. Now remember, silence is not your enemy. And sometimes quiet companionship is more healing than words can ever be. Sometimes you're sitting there and somebody starts crying. Let them cry. Don't jump in and try to comfort them and tell them, oh, you'll be all right, or it's good to cry. Just be quiet. Don't just say something, sit there. And be aware of group members who appear to be re-traumatized by the work they're doing. You need to be prepared to help them find outside counsel if they believe it would help. And again, remember, this is in the context of you in a small group. You may experience that in a counseling situation. Say, you know what, I'm just not at a place where I feel equipped to, or I feel like I'm the best fit for you at this part of your healing journey. There are some people I know who are really gifted in this area, and I'd love to be able to connect you with them. Would that be okay? See what they say to that. Say, well, I'm not really sure. Well, why don't you think about it, pray about it, and maybe we can talk about it next time. So you don't want to pressure them, but if you feel like you're out of your element or not prepared for this, let them know. You know, I want to be the best help that I can be, and right now I don't think this is an area that I can be the best help for you. Okay. So that brings us to the end of this session.